Hey guys, welcome back to WebMD&DM, where I diagnose the discussions that take place around my table while playing both games, the Dungeons and the Dragons. Now, as you know, normally I do campaign diaries mixed in with some DM ranting. However, after my vacation, which you can notice my going away video here, which was a minute long and had terrible quality and really served no point than just to let you know that I was taking a break. After taking that vacation, I had this thought pop into my head, and it's a thought that has refused to leave me ever since. It's the thought that I think most dungeon masters and players and anybody who plays a little bit too much RPG gets into. It was the thought of what would this character or this person or that person be with my favorite system stats. Now, in this video, as you can probably have already told by the title, I was curious, after having recently seen it, what the cast of Hamilton would be if you converted it over into D&D. Now, this was mostly spurred on by the fact that it was mentioned in Critical Role, where they mentioned Hercules Mulligan being a barbarian. And I disagree, but we'll get to him later on if you're interested. Right now, I want to look at the star of Alexander Hamilton, who is, in fact, Alexander Hamilton. Now, as I'm going through this character creation of Hamilton, I want you to understand that this is going to be taking the full entirety of that 3-hour play and condensing it down into a character sheet. So if you haven't seen Hamilton, you don't know about Hamilton, and you want to be surprised by what Hamilton has in store for you, I would not recommend watching this video because there will be no restraint on spoilers. Consider this your spoiler alert. So, today we're going to be taking Alexander Hamilton from the play, not historical figure, not this guy, but this guy, and turning him into a D&D level 1 character. The reason I'm making him a level 1 character is because I love the fact that in the play, the second song in the whole play is Alexander Hamilton and the other main character of the play, Aaron Burr, meeting in a bar, aka a tavern. And then they run across Hercules Mulligan and Lafayette and John Laurens, and those 5 become the main heroes of the first act, and most of them carry over, or their actions carry over into the second act. So, it is quite literally the beginnings of a D&D campaign in which the DM, who was short on ideas at the time, like this guy, said, you all meet in a tavern. So I just kind of had this idea of basically rewriting Hamilton in a D&D campaign format, which I might get to. Let me know if you're interested for that particular series of videos. But right now, we're going to focus on Alexander Hamilton. Now, to do that, we're going to be doing a little bit of a different format. We're going to be mostly on my computer screen with a little bit of me on the side, and we're going to fill in his character sheets as we go. So here we go with the transitions. All right, here we are. So first things first, we're going to sort out the character's name, which will be the easiest part of this whole thing. Trust me, it is going to be Alexander Hamilton as played by Lin-Manuel Miranda. Perfect. Now, as a level 1 hero, he will be starting with 0 hit points, or experience points. Sorry, that would be a really short campaign if he had 0 hit points. And I think, since I've already put some thought into this, we're going to do his personality, ideals, bonds, and flaws first, and then I will use these as sort of the thesis statements of the essay that is this character sheet. So you'll be able to see what these are, and then you'll see as I go through and build out the rest of him where I came up with these ideas. So for his personality trait is, when I set my mind, I follow through no matter what. And of course, he gets 2 of these. The second one is, I'm confident in my own abilities and inspire confidence in those around me. There we are. Now, these personality traits mostly come about of the second act and the actions that he and his fellows take as they're going through their adventures. So we'll get to those later on, I think. Now we move down to the ideal. Now his ideal is, I will not throw away my shot, because of course it is. Now that is a fairly good ideal. Basically what it means is that he is always going to be striving for he's always going to take his chances and seek to better himself, essentially. Like, he is always trying to put himself in a better position. He is always going to be the immigrant coming up from the bottom, struggling his way through the ranks, through the military, up to Washington's right hand, up to the Secretary of Treasury, and up and up and up and up. He is always reaching for that next opportunity. He's always struggling, always striving. And I think that pretty much sums up Alexander Hamilton's actions overall. It's sort of, in terms of ideal, it's probably more of a neutral good / any. I think I might have actually translated it over from the any option in the folk hero background, which we'll get to his background in a second. It's basically like he is always going to be striving towards his destiny. Nothing will stop him from reaching his destiny. And I converted it over into this because it is one of the main lines that is used in the play, like over and over and over again. It's a famous line, but it seemed to really encompass his ideal, what he's always striving for, which is what an ideal is supposed to be. Next up, we have the bond. Now, for the bond, I kind of had a little bit of difficulty with this because a bond is something that you're supposed to have in your past that connects you into the world. Now, typically, a bond is something physical and real and present. Like, a soldier will have their favorite weapon, a clansman will have their clan, a folk hero will have their village, that sort of stuff. But for Alexander Hamilton, he was kind of, in D&D sense, he was kind of written with a stereotypical, generic, I don't have a home, I came from nowhere type background, because he arrives, he starts in the town of Providence, he loses his mother, his father runs out, he gets sick, he survives, he struggles his way, a hurricane comes and destroys him, and then he gathers up alms and is able to pay for his way over to the mainland. That is all encompassed in the very first song, Alexander Hamilton. But the thing is, in terms of D&D sense, that is the stereotypical I came from nowhere background. It's terrible to hear it in the musical, but if you brought that as a character to a D&D table, they would all roll their eyes and chuckle at the unoriginality of it. So he doesn't really have a bond to start with. So I kind of tweaked it a little bit, and I gave him the bond of his friends. As he says in the My Shot song, I never had a group of friends before, I promise that I'll make you all proud. Essentially, he will always strive to be loyal to his friends, and so I said that he's never had friends before and will stand by them no matter what. That is what his ideal, his bond is. That's what his bond is. His bond is his friends that he has right here and now. And finally, the flaw. What is wrong with Alexander Hamilton? Now, for my money, the only thing I could possibly put for Alexander Hamilton's flaw is that he can't say no to this, which, if you know the soundtrack, you know is the song that he's using that basically watches him slip and fall into an extramarital affair with a woman. But I think that if you take that phrase, can't say no to this, and apply it to other situations, it's still true. Like, yes, he can't say no to the affair. He has the lust for carnal pleasures, but that's not the only time that I think it comes into play. For example, the real moment of failure, the moment that absolutely destroys Hamilton, isn't can't say no to this. It comes in Hurricane. And in Hurricane, his personality trait and his flaw both work to destroy his political career. What truly destroys Hamilton's political career is Hurricane, where his personality trait, I'm confident in my abilities and inspire confidence in those around me, and his flaw, he can't say no to this, work together to defeat him. If you ask him the question, can I write my way out of this situation? Can I use my skills to save myself from the mess that I've put myself in? Which is basically the question being asked in the final minutes of Hurricane. He can't say no to that. He believes utterly in his abilities to write his way out because it is literally how he has survived so long. So he cannot say, no, I can't write my way out. He has to say yes, and he tries to write his way out, and he fails, and that's what destroys his political career. When you pull it even further back, when Washington asks him to be his right-hand man, can Hamilton say no to taking this chance, to grabbing this shot and furthering himself in terms of social standing, no, he can't say no to this opportunity. Like, just throughout the whole play, he can't say no to the opportunities. He is never satisfied. He can't say no to his chances, and he can't say no to the abilities of his own abilities. He can't say no when his failings come back and bite him in the ass. He literally can't say no to this, to anything. And that's why it's his flaw. Not only because he succumbs to the machinations of the Reynolds, but he also because he just literally cannot say no to opportunities. So, now that we know his personality essentially boiled down into 5 different quirks and traits, now we're going to go over to his background, which can mostly be summed up from the song Alexander Hamilton. In Alexander Hamilton, the song, they mention that when he was 14, he got placed in charge of a trading charter, and he spent years trading sugarcane and rum and all the things he can't afford, trading and saving and buying every treatise on the shelf. And he was basically reading and increasing his learning and bettering himself until a hurricane came and devastation reigned. He lost his mom to illness years ago. He loses his mother. He loses his father. He loses his cousin. He gets placed in charge of a trading charter where he spends his time being the brains, the accountant running things behind the screens. And eventually all of that is taken away when a hurricane comes and destroys it. Now, to get the actual background, like the words to put on this page, I actually had to go much further ahead, back to Hurricane, back to what I mentioned over in the Flaws, where he specifically mentions that when he was a kid and the hurricane came and devastated it, he has this line where he mentions that a hurricane came and destroyed his town and he survived. And he wrote his way out. He wrote everything he saw, what he saw, how he felt about what he saw. And when he looked up, the town had his eyes on him. And they passed the plate around, gathered up the money, and sent him to the mainland to get his education, which was also a line back in Alexander Hamilton, the song, which I really enjoyed. But the point was, he got his start. He arrived in the tavern because of his ability to help and convince a town to help him, which to me sounds an awful lot like the folk hero background. So that's what I chose for Alexander Hamilton. He was somebody who pretty much he didn't have a special calling in essence. He was part of a town, the town needed help, and he rose to help it. And after helping it, the town responded with gratitude and helped him. So that really felt like a folk hero background. He came from the roots and he rose up, which also kind of ties back into the idea that he is an immigrant coming up from the bottom. He's starting with nothing. Literally lost his entire family, which was a huge deal back then. Had no money, had a job that he spent most of those wages on survival and books to then educate himself. And when he lost all that, then he had the support of others to help send him to a higher education. So he went from here, and then got the money, and he went and got his education. And that's where the campaign starts. And then he starts working his way up to about here level at the end of the campaign. But next, we're going to move on to the race. Now, this was also really easy because, in my mind, they don't mention a lot of dwarves. They don't mention a lot of elves. They don't mention a lot of halflings. And while I could take those races, figure out which race might apply to which class, it makes more sense that these are humans. I'm going to write them as humans because somebody like you, who might be just looking for a real quick conversion, is going to just use human. They're just going to be like, oh, this is a human, I'm going to use human. In the same way that you might take Legolas and convert him, and he's an elf, so my character is going to be an elf. It's that simple. Now, you could do that, but honestly, it felt fine making him a human, especially since they were all the same race. And also, there's a lot of variability in the stats built in already, so I didn't feel that much need to change it. When I have just using the standard array to figure it all out, I didn't feel the need to really go that noodly with what I was planning. And on top of that, like, humans are supposed to be the dominant race of most D&D campaigns, all the way back to first edition up until about 3.5 or 4th, when races started getting a little bit more equal. Humans were supposed to be the dominant, and in this story, humans usually were the dominant, and in most of my campaigns, humans are the dominant, so it just made sense for there to be a human. So next we're going to start cracking into the 6 basic stats: the strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Real quick rundown of those: strength, how much you can carry; dex, how quickly you can move your feet; constitution, how hardy you are, how much crap you can stomach before you start throwing up; intelligence, how many facts you know; wisdom, how easily you are able to apply the knowledge that you might know into certain situations; and charisma, your force of personality to convince people to follow you or to be afraid of you. Now, the way I did this was I did the primary stat, their best stat first, then I did their dump stat, their weakest stat next, followed by the other stats as it seemed to make sense. Usually it came down to a comparison, like I have 3 remaining stats in the play, they had this, that, and the other thing, compare them, this was higher than that, was lower than that, and put them together like that. So, for Alexander Hamilton, it was a really, really easy first choice in my opinion. He is so charismatic, not just in the sense that Lin-Manuel Miranda is charismatic, because by God that guy is charismatic, but in the sense that Alexander Hamilton himself, Lin-Manuel's presentation of Alexander Hamilton was very charismatic in comparison to other people, in the sense that charisma is not based around convincing people to follow you with logic and reason. It is based around convincing them to follow you because they believe you're right. They believe that you know what you're talking about and you should be listened to. You don't have to back it up with logic and reason and facts and stuff like that. You just have to convince them with the force of your personality. And that is exactly what Hamilton does. He's a great lawyer, not in the sense that he presents these great arguments that are well thought out and if A then B, if B then C. He just persuades you with the force of what he has to say. He has to holler to be heard with every word, and he literally hollers every word he's got. He puts his whole soul into what he has to say, and he makes you listen, he makes you pay attention. And that is exactly what charisma is all about. So it was such an easy choice for him to be a charisma based. With that, we have a pretty strong inkling of what this character is probably going to be. There are 3 classes, I believe, that use charisma as a base. There's the Bard, there's the Sorcerer, and the Paladin's spellcasting, I think are the main ones. There might be another one. Feel free to let me know where I got it wrong. So right now we're basically narrowed down to Bard or Sorcerer, but we'll get to character class once we finish the rest of the stats. So now we know what he's great at. He's great at using his emotions and just force to convince you to listen to him. And that was a really big thing in Nonstop, where he writes nonstop over and over and over again, writing 51 essays on how to convince you that this is what you should be using. This is the Constitution you want. And he doesn't do it, he probably does it very persuasively with logic and reasoning, because nothing can truly be based outside of that, but he does it a lot more through just the sheer emotion that he's throwing at you. Compare his opening statements of the trial versus Burr's opening statements of the trial. Hamilton is so emphatic, and he's talking about this is the very first murder trial and we are making history and how great is it to be alive, versus Burr, which is very calculating and cold, and he's succinct, persuasive, which we'll get to Aaron Burr in a later video, hopefully. But in terms of that, his weakest stat for me was also really easy when you base it off of both his flaw and his actions. He is great at convincing you to listen to him through the sheer emotion of his words. But those same emotions are what get him into trouble more often than not. He gets into trouble because he doesn't have the common sense to back out of a situation before it becomes a problem. He doesn't have the common sense to not get into a duel despite his commanding officer's words to not get into a duel. Like, he played the 6-year-old, you didn't say that he couldn't do it, I was just the bystander. That is an argument that would not fly with most parents, let alone George fucking Washington. He doesn't think that far ahead. He doesn't process the next thing. As he mentions in My Shot, for the first time I'm thinking past tomorrow. He literally never doesn't think ahead to the consequences of his actions. He just seizes the opportunity for what it is immediately and charges in. He leaps into things without thinking of the consequences that might come after it. He would rather be divisive than indecisive. He doesn't want to think, he doesn't want to wait for it. He wants to go. This is what needs to be done. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going over here. Versus Burr, who is much more wait for it. He calms and he thinks and he plans it out. He's chess mastering. He's thinking 4 moves ahead, whereas Hamilton is so busy doing the next move that he's not thinking ahead, and you can't plan around his strategies because he doesn't have one. But that does get him into trouble when he can't think of the consequences of having an extramarital affair, and he doesn't think of what the consequences of his Reynolds pamphlet could be. He writes himself into trouble both because he thinks he can write himself out of it and because he doesn't think of what the consequences could be of his actions. So for me, it was a very easy choice that his wisdom has to be his lowest stat. Which is still not all that low. As a standard array character, he gets a 9, which is only a -1. And you can easily counteract that with proficiencies in a lot of the skills. But that was a pretty easy choice for me. The charisma was really easy because he convinces you through the force of his personality, and his wisdom was really easy because he always goes into it with his emotions first, which is something that a low wisdom, high intelligence, high charisma character would do. So these 2 stats were really easy for me. Now, the next 2 stats I'm going to do are the next highest and the next lowest, and they both kind of tie in to one line from Satisfied. Now the line is, when Angelica Schuyler meets Alexander Hamilton for the very first time, and she's sizing him up, and she realizes that he has intelligent eyes, which we know he's intelligent from the very first song. He's retreating and reading every treatise on the shelf. He's basically buying up and reading all these books on various subjects. He's learning. He becomes intelligent. Certainly smart enough to get into the college that he wants. If he didn't, you let his emotions get ahead of him, and he punches the bursar, which causes the whole problem with getting into the college. Yet again, low wisdom. Forgot about that example. But he is smart. He's not an idiot. He is definitely a smart person, and Angelica Schuyler realizes this, and that's why his 14 has to go into his intelligence. So he is definitely a smart man. There's no doubt about that. But in the very same line, like I cut that line halfway. Intelligent eyes and a hunger-pained face. Now, for those of you unfamiliar, hunger-pained essentially means that you were ill-fed. You are hungry. Now, you can always interpret it in the metaphorical sense, but I do that a lot already with the can't say no to this. He's always hungry. He's never satisfied. He's always striving for more. He wants a higher position. He wants more power. He wants control over more things. He wants to be higher in the social standing. He never stops. He can't stop. He's not satisfied yet. He keeps going. But at the same time, if you look at it in a more literal sense, it probably applies just as much. He probably, due to the fact that he lost his mother, he lost his father, he lost his cousin who was his provider up until that point, and mentioning in Helpless, he grew up, what was it? My father left, my mother died, I grew up buck wild. He literally didn't have anybody providing for him in the context of the play. He basically was hunger-pained in a literal sense as well as a metaphorical sense. He literally did not have enough to eat growing up. He would save his money and not eat meals and use that money that he would have spent on food to buy books, and then he would read those books. And then eventually he'd get so hungry to the point that he would buy food and eat the food. But he spent a lot of his childhood not having somebody paying for his food and not being able to pay for his own food, which caused him to have a somewhat more sickly, wiry frame. Like he's a little bit more slight than you might expect from a person of that background. So that is why his constitution is his next lowest stat. He has intelligent eyes, but a hunger-pained face. Now then, for the next 2 stats, once again, this is where this final step, the final 2 stats, is usually where it comes down to a comparison, because you have 2 numbers left and you have 2 options left. So you basically just compare the 2 and figure out which one makes the most sense for this character. And another big problem is I'm using a play to sort of interpret how they would play in D&D, but D&D is a highly tactical, combat-based game. Like, role-playing happens, and they use the skills to try and integrate more of that into the game and give you mechanics to grab onto, but it is still tactical war gamers narrowing the focus down to singular characters on a grid and moving them to defeat the various enemies. That is still the main point of the game. So it is, but the play is not about combat. It takes place in the middle of a war, but it is not about the combat. It's about the people interacting with each other and off of each other and how those interactions shape our history. So to try and figure out what two of the most combat-based stats are for characters who don't do combat was definitely a lot more of a challenge, especially when I get into some of the characters who have a lot less focus in the play, like Lawrence Mulligan, Marquis de Lafayette. Those three definitely were a challenge, but we'll get to them hopefully later. For Alexander Hamilton here, he grew up in a time when combat was done with guns at a distance. So it was a lot more range focused. So you can see where I'm going with this. Now, he's definitely not a lightweight when it comes to guns. We don't see him fire a gun at any point, but we can assume that he wouldn't be a successful decorated war veteran who served with General Washington if he wasn't a somewhat competent gunman. And gunmen would be more focused on a dex-based skill rather than a strength-based skill. And something that's a little bit more historically based, something that I just happen to know off the top of my head because of classes I took in college. During that time, dancing was basically considered flirting, much in the same way that it is in our culture now, but with a little bit more class in my opinion. Like being able to perform the right steps in the right manner with your feet, with your partner at the same time was considered a very valuable trait. It showed that you were educated and capable. So for that, being dex-based would be a high benefit in this society, whereas being strength is not so much. You leave the strength abilities to the dockhands or to the cannoneers or to the common rabble. You, as a more educated gentleman, which Hamilton would become by midway through the first act, he would not have a very high focus on strength. He would have a much greater focus on the dexterity for the gunmanship and for the dancing. So for that, I'm going to give his 13 bumped to a 14 to his dex, and then a 12 bumped to a 13 for strength. As a level 1 character, he will automatically have +2 for his proficiency bonus. That is something you don't even really have to think about. It's just automatic. As is the armor class being dex-based with a +2, and as a human, he gets 30 feet, i.e. 6 squares. Now, coming up here to his class, I think you already know what it is I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyways, just in case. He does most of his work in the campaign. He does most of it through words and through writing. He has incredible prose that convinces people to listen to what he has to say or turns public opinion against him when he fails his persuasion check. Wink. I definitely get the vibe that he is a bard. He writes essays. He creates the stories that you then listen to, and that's what inspires you to go on and do things yourself. So for me, as compared to a sorcerer, it made a lot more sense for him to be a bard who happened to have some proficiencies with guns and crossbows at range than it did for him to be a sorcerer casting lots of like fireball and very flashy, showy spells. So he is going to be a bard level 1 when we are introduced to Alexander Hamilton in the tavern at the beginning of the play. All right, and next up we have his alignment. Now, alignment is definitely a tricky thing because as Matt Colville covered in his alignment video, most characters in fiction don't have alignments with one exception. So to figure out the alignment of a character that's not designed in a system that has alignments is a little bit tricky, but basically you look at their actions and the codes that they follow that create those actions and figure out how those would interpret into D&D alignment. And so for Alexander Hamilton, he's part of a revolution. He's part of a revolution to throw off what they view as an oppressive government, the American Revolution. He is literally part of a revolution. But that might give you the inkling that he is chaotic, but I think he is actually more lawful because after throwing off that government, he then works very hard to create a government that he is a part of. So he doesn't strike me as a chaotic alignment. He's not overthrowing the government for the sake of having overthrown a government. He is working to overthrow an oppressive government to then become a part of a better government. So he leans more towards the lawful in my perspective. And then in the axes of good versus evil, he tends to do things, he certainly doesn't do good things all the time, but if he did good things all the time, he wouldn't be an interesting character, so we have to forgive him some mistakes as human error. On the general, he tries to do the right thing. He tries to help people a lot more than he tries to hurt them, which is a big factor in what I consider your alignment. For example, he educates his son on how to duel, but he tells him not to fire his gun at the opponent. He tells him to clearly establish he is not interested in fighting this battle because he doesn't want Philip to be wounded emotionally, and he doesn't want his wife to suffer any heartbreak that might come. Now, obviously, because of whatever happened with Mr. James Eaker, or George Eaker, my mistake, whatever happened with Mr. Eaker, Philip ends up dying anyways, but Hamilton tries to tell him not to fight, which is a big part of a good versus evil alignment, in my opinion. In my opinion, good versus evil, it breaks down to good people will help without a second thought and will harm only when it is absolutely necessary, whereas evil people will harm without a second thought in the belief that they are doing the right thing, but will offer aid only as a last resort. So a good person will give the beggar $5 and will not fight a battle unless it is absolutely necessary. Whereas an evil person will beat the shit out of that mugger, but probably won't give the $5 to that beggar unless they are absolutely forced to for some reason. So given all that, the fact that Hamilton, within the bounds of society, because he is lawful, within the bounds of society, he tries to do the right thing, I believe him to be a lawful good character. Now, as a bard, he gets some standard stuff that is just automatic. It doesn't matter what character class it matters what character class he is. It doesn't matter what kind of personality he has. So I'm just going to quickly fill in some details here while ranting about the fact that I am doing that. So, just out of curiosity, how are you guys doing? You guys doing good? You having fun watching this video? I'm actually having a lot more fun making this video than I might have realized I would be. Mostly just because for some reason, it really gets my words flowing to talk about this sort of stuff. Certainly a lot more than that boring campaign I was doing. Holy crap, that was terrible. So, I just finished filling in his proficiencies and his equipment, and you can see there are some parentheses built in. For example, the rapier is Washington's gift, and the diplomat's pack is scholar schooling, and some of these things like having a calligrapher's kit, I just figured I'd jump in real quick and explain those. The rapier is Washington's gift because I think it was History Has Its Eye on You, Washington gives him a sword, which is supposed to represent his command. And that is where he gets the rapier. It's a little bit different with the time scale, but I wanted to tie in his weapon to part of what happens in the campaign because that just seemed really cool. Diplomat's pack is coming because of these scholar schooling that he gets. He goes to a college, he gets educated. A lot of these proficiencies, they just some of them, like the weapons and armor and a lot of the tools, just came about because that's because he is a bard and he needs that sort of stuff. The languages, English became common in essence. Spanish, I kind of just guessed. I figured he knew something. And then the calligrapher's kit mostly came about because he is a bard. He writes. He doesn't sing. He writes a lot. So I wanted to give him something to write with. A calligrapher's kit just made the most sense in those contexts. So now we're going to hop into his skills. Now, his skills are definitely an interesting topic, mostly because I had a hard time coming up with them, so I had to think a little bit about what each one was. Now, as part of the folk hero, he gets animal handling and survival right off the top, so that kind of helps negate his low wisdom. But he is good at riding horses, and he is good at tracking his way through the wilderness. Now, some of that actually kind of ties in to something that happens in the Battle of Yorktown, which we'll get to in just a second. But first, the an obvious grab, especially for a bard who has access to everything, had to be Persuasion. Because, once again, what he does is literally persuade people to listen to him based off of how he's talking and what he's doing and the way he's acting. So Persuasion was a very easy grab, especially for Alexander Hamilton. The next one I decided to grab, and it was kind of an interesting choice, was Stealth. Now, the reason I grabbed Stealth was because in the Battle of Yorktown song, he mentions that his military strategy is to take the bullets out of their guns, move undercover as one through the night up to the enemy's lines before they can do anything and hit them by surprise. And they don't want to let a stray gun shot give them away, so that's why they do it, and they have the sudden bayonet charge. But to do that, you kind of have to have a sense of how to move stealthily to understand what to do and how to do it. So I figured stealth would be a pretty good option in this instance. So that's where the stealth came from. Now, I wanted something to reflect his intelligence more so than just the +2 from his intelligence modifier. I wanted to give him a skill in the intelligence, so I started looking through the options there. Investigation is probably a good choice, but it didn't really fit anything within the play, and that's what I was looking for, was context clues for something that I could point to and be like, this is why I chose it. Now, religion could work, but Alexander Hamilton mentions in It's Quiet Uptown that he was not a religious person. He never really went to church. So to be aware of religious customs without having gone to church didn't make a lot of sense to me. Neither did nature. Like, you could say he read a lot of books on what things were and sort of like the biology and the understanding, but that didn't really feel like an Alexander Hamilton style to me. He didn't feel like a biologist. He didn't feel like a doctor. He felt like somebody who knew a lot about things that had happened before, and he used it to inform his decisions going forward. Like, he was very educated in maths and finance, so he was a lot more grounded in his knowledge. Not in the sense of a biological sense, but more in a mathematics sense. So nature didn't really make a lot of sense to me. And Arcana really didn't make a lot of sense to me because this is a modern history telling. There is literally no science in it. And in fact, as a bard, he gets access to spells. I picked spells that were pretty deliberately not based in combat or flashy spells. He doesn't throw fireballs. He uses words to viciously mock people, which we'll get to in just a second. But it seemed to me that the best choice out of all of these was history. So that is the one that I grabbed. And then just real quickly, his features and traits. He has rustic hospitality. As he is an immigrant coming up from the bottom, he has come from the ground, and so he's very familiar with it, and he's very familiar with the people who work it. So he's able to get some protection and understanding with them, with the common people, at least in the very beginning. Near the middle of the campaign, he starts to lose touch with that, but that's a discussion for another day. And of course, as a bard, he has bardic inspiration, which he's able to give to his allies and inspire the confidence in them to do things. So now we're going to pop over to his spellcasting, and that's going to be really quick, I'd like to think. In terms of cantrips, he has Vicious Mockery, which every good bard should have. It doubly makes sense because, as Thomas Jefferson says, we slam each other in the press and we don't print redactions. Essentially, they publish bad words about each other to harm them. They harm them in more of a political, emotional, public eye type view, but this would also work. He's viciously mocking people and causing them pain. And then the next cantrip, his second one, I took Friends, because it lends itself more to the fact that he is a persuasive individual. He convinces you to listen to him. So he uses this trickery and this fast talk and this double speak and you should listen to me type stuff to then convince you to listen to him as to what he has to say and then follow his opinion. So the Friends was kind of like his not spellcasting way of convincing you to listen to what he has to say, sort of thing. So that's where that came from. Now he knows a handful of spells, and I chose buff and counter buff spells that would help his allies and debuff spells that would harm his enemies, because in terms of spell casting, he's not throwing fireballs, he's not launching firebolts, he's not using magic missiles to harm people. He is using words to sway public opinion either for or against the person. So it made a lot of sense to use things like Dissonant Whispers. Dissonant Whispers kind of uses him convincing the underlings to turn against their superiors sort of situation. He uses the Dissonant Whispers to cause this paranoia in other people, which caused them to then run away, essentially. Another one is, of course, Charm Person. For same reason as Friends, he is using his spell casting as a persuasive mechanism to convince you to listen to what he has to say beyond what his charisma would already lend him to be able to do. And then I chose Heroism. I will discuss why Heroism, as well as part of the personality trait, the Inspire Confidence in others, in just a moment, as soon as we wrap up here. But he has Heroism for the very same reason, which we'll get to. And last, I chose Bane, because once again, he's using his words he insults them to the point of unnerving. And a great example of this was one of the ones that I just automatically had to pick when I really thought about it, was in Farmer Refuted, when the farmer, Samuel Seabury, is literally reading his speech out. And the first time he does it flawlessly. But then Alexander Hamilton steps up onto the stage and he starts singing his own versions of some of the words and turning the phrases against the farmer. And the farmer starts to get flustered and he starts to lose traction. He starts saying less. He starts becoming more quiet. And the farmer tries to regain control and fails. And Alexander Hamilton just keeps going on and on and on and just belittling the guy. And he causes him to become so flustered that he basically loses. He basically loses the discussion. And the essence of that is in Bane, where he literally just out-talks the other person to the point where they are unnerved and unable to do anything. And that is represented by failing your charisma against his charisma and getting the extra D4 tacked onto all your rolls for the rest of the battle. So Bane was a really great representation of his ability to talk you down to the point where you couldn't do anything anymore. So, at this point, we have finished Alexander Hamilton's character sheet. You could go back in and fill in all of this stuff over here with the skills, so you could list it out exactly what is happening. I think he actually gets charisma and dex saving throw, so I'm just going to tack those on real quickly, but those are less important right now. And he didn't take perception, so his perception is crap. He's got a 9 passive, but anyways, that is his character sheet filled out. All the mechanics are dealt with. But I want to go back and I want to show you this personality and I want you to see if you can understand why I made these choices where I made them. So, this first one, he sets his mind to it, he follows through no matter what. That was taken because he doesn't really leave projects unfinished. He follows through and he makes sure things get done. A great example of that is in The Room Where It Happens, where he needs to get this bill passed and he tries to use words and he tries to use logic and he tries to use refutements, and eventually he just gives in and he uses compromise and bargaining and convinces his enemies to help him. So in that one, he followed through on his project to get the bill passed no matter what. He literally did something he never thought he would do and just did it and got it over with. And then next up, the Inspire Confidence. His confidence in his abilities, which we've mentioned and I think you can understand, he definitely is confident in his abilities, but more than that, his ability to inspire confidence in those around him comes from, I think, my shot when he convinces the tavern to rise up with him in the revolution, and he convinces his friends to rise up, and he convinces the common folk to rise up. All of that is them rising up based solely off of his passion to get them moving. But it also comes into play in the election of 1800 and shortly after The Room Where It Happens. In particular, a line in the election of 1800 is what caused me to really choose this, where he meets Aaron Burr on the street, and he mentions that Aaron Burr is openly campaigning. That's new. And he says, Alexander Hamilton says, "Is there anything you wouldn't do?" And Aaron Burr says, "No, I'm chasing what I want, and you know what? I learned that from you." Basically implying that Alexander Hamilton taught Aaron Burr how to be confident and how to go for what you want. It just happened to be at a really poor time and after some really poor actions on Burr's part, which then caused Hamilton to turn against him later on in the play. Not much later on, because that was the end of the play, but right at the very end there. But Alexander Hamilton inspired confidence in his allies and in his friends turned enemies throughout the play. So it really made sense for him to be able to inspire that confidence in others, and that was another reason why I chose Bard, because it has the inspiration mechanic. Literally built in, he inspires people. So that is one of the main reasons why that is there. Next up, the not throw away his shot. I already mentioned it was the destiny rewarding ideal from Folk Hero, converted a little bit to fit within a very, very famous and ever-present line within the play, which I thought was very fitting. And then the never had friends, will stand by them. Again, that came from his quote, I never had a group of friends before, I promise that I'll make you all proud. He doesn't have a history growing up. He just he latches on to these friends that he gains, and he follows them. He listens to them and he helps them throughout most of the play. And that's sort of where that bond came from, because again, he doesn't have a bond prior to them. It's not quite a perfect bond, but it fits his character and his actions so well that it made the most sense. And then again, can't say no to this. As I mentioned before, he has that low wisdom, and he literally doesn't think of the consequences ahead of his actions. He leaps in, and 80 to 90% of the time, it pays off in his favor, and he plays and he raises the stakes and he changes the game over and over and over again. But a lot of times it bites him in the ass, and he has to struggle and work to get out of it, which I think would make him a really interesting character to play. I would probably love to play this guy, to be honest with you, because he has that low wisdom, which makes him leap in without thinking. He has that high charisma to try and get himself out of situations. Some of my favorite moments as a player come from when I have written myself into a problem and then have to think my way out of it. For example, one of my favorite examples was this catastrophe wave that seemed like it was building and building and building until I eventually resolved it. Me and some other heroes were in this town, and some racist guards had come from a nearby town and were picking up supplies before turning and leaving. And one of my companions, a kobold named Keedith, decided he wanted to go investigate those caravans because he wasn't quite sure that these people were on the up and up. Now, I knew from personal experience that these Hillsfarians were assholes, and one of my close friends in the group was a former Hillsfarian who had decided they were assholes and left. So we all had a lot of exposure to them, and we already knew what we were getting into. But Keedith hadn't really had an association with them, but he wanted to go in and check it out anyways. And we were all totally fine with that because it sounded cool. So my friend, the cleric wizard, cast invisibility on Keedith, and Keedith ran around and snuck in through the back and was going to start rifling through it. And he asked me to be a distraction, which I found perfect. And I was like, yes, absolutely, I will totally be a distraction. I won't cause too much trouble. And the first thing I do is I walk up to the guy, and this is my character, Bronze de Logion, who is a half-elf bard, and of course, all elves, they of course talk with French accents, because why not? He goes up and he just immediately starts insulting the guy. I think he said something along the lines of, hey, you racist pricks, or something to that effect. And he basically just started insulting him, and as the guy tried to recover, I just insulted him again. I didn't even cast Vicious Mockery, which I should have. It would have been hilarious. I insulted them to the point that the two guards who I'd been insulting came over and started talking to me, which bought Keedith the distraction he needed to get into the caravan. Two guards come over to me, and one of them decides they're going to try and punch me. However, I am able to use Suggestion to remind the other guard about the time that guy insulted his mother, at which point that guard instead takes a swing at the guard who he thinks insulted his mother, and that causes them to start brawling. But their brawling attracts the attention of their captain. Now the captain comes over, so now I've got three guards, two of them are fighting each other, and the captain's starting to break them up, so pretty soon they're going to realize that I was the one causing all the trouble and start trying to gang up on me, at which point I use the first level spell Fairy Fire, and I set fire to the top of one of the wagons, and I point to it and I shout, "Fire!" At which point, another 10 guards burst out of the warehouse and start immediately rushing to go put the thing out, at which point I see Keedith coming out from behind the caravan. He's walking along, and he's got like a little satchel hidden away, and he's stealthing pretty successfully, at which point I turn and I just start walking away. And that was it. Like, literally, like, it goes from 2 guards, which I then deal with, to then being 3 guards, about to have the situation under control, and then I cause another problem. That causes 10 guards, and I realize that now's a good time for me to get the hell out of Dodge. And it was basically just building, and then I was able to get out of it. So those are the moments that I really love, the moments where a player is faced with a problem. They solve the problem in a way that then causes other problems. Those problems that then have to solve those problems, and as they solve those problems, new problems show up. And so it's basically just improvising their way through a scene that they're desperately trying to stay one step ahead of the problems that are confronting them, and eventually the heroes succeed. That's what makes it great. It also is what makes it difficult, because a lot of times it's either a really easy to solve solution, like the DM already knows that they have to do this one thing and then it's over, so it's not, it doesn't build, or it's something where once they fail, they're locked out of it pretty much. Like, they have to do this one thing and they fail. Done. So now they're in irons. And then you gotta wait till the next scene, and then they gotta pick their way out of it. It's less engaging because they don't have that chance of like trying to recover and suddenly get back onto their feet and like sort of improvise their way into a new scene and then out of that scene just as quickly. Like, it's not as fast paced essentially. But this is the kind of character who would be in that kind of situation. He would totally talk himself into a problem and then have to talk his way right back out of it. And I love that about him, and that is why I find this character interesting. Now, you may disagree with some of these choices that I made. You might agree with me wholeheartedly, or you might want to jump onto YouTube, make your own video and be, you were totally wrong. This is where you went wrong and this is why it should be this way. Please do that. Please leave comments telling me how wrong I was and why I was wrong. Leave comments telling me how excited you are for the next video. Leave comments suggesting characters for me to convert, because I was planning on converting at the very least Aaron Burr, because he was interesting to break down as well. I want to do Aaron Burr, probably the other 3 side characters, maybe, if there's interest for them. And then I also want to take this in another direction. I want to start converting just generally. I want to convert like the cast of Moana. I found also interesting, like trying to break them down in my head. And then there's the obvious options of breaking down the cast of Lord of the Rings, which I think a lot of people have already done, so it's less engaging to me overall, but I still want to try and do it. I want to put my spin on things. And then, of course, there's all sorts of fiction characters that I don't even know about. And I would love for you guys to leave suggestions in the comments down below. Who do you want to see me take a look at and break down and reconfigure into a character sheet? Let me know all those types of things down in the doobly-doo down below. I am excitedly looking forward to seeing them, and I hope you leave very interesting, engaging comments. But, as always, thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you had as much fun watching it and watching my decisions as I had making it. As you can probably tell from the rest of the video, I really had a lot of fun doing this. Leave your comments, all that sort of stuff in the blah blah down below. Don't forget to roll your charisma saving throw against that subscription button. Please feel free to share this video. I would like other people to see it just as much as you saw it, especially if you enjoyed it. If you didn't enjoy it, then I understand why you wouldn't share it, and there's no reason to cause other people suffering. But I hope you all enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave all that blah blah down below. I hope you all have a lovely day, and until I see you next time, take care.